I will never forget that scene on the dirt road. I, a widowed rancher, found an injured elderly woman hugging a dog with all her strength, as if she were protecting something much bigger. And in that instant, I realized there was something strange going on that didn't make sense. What I discovered next left me completely floored. But before I tell you, comment what you thought of this story. Give it a rating from 0 to 10, and tell me what city you are watching from. I really want to get to know you better and see if you stayed until the end. The roar of the river arrived before the image. John had gone out that Tuesday afternoon riding his buckskin horse to check the pasture fence bordering Boulder River. A routine chore, the kind a man does on autopilot while his mind wanders elsewhere. A widower for 2 years, the 54-year-old rancher carried the stiffness of someone who learned the hard way that feeling too much costs dearly. He was the type who fixed the front gate by himself, who ate supper in silence, who never asked for a hand. The neighbors said John was a good man, but locked up tight as a safe without a combination. The horse stopped in its tracks, its ears swiveled forward, tense. That was when he saw it. Down the muddy embankment leading to the river, an elderly woman sat on the ground, her blouse torn at the shoulder, her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. She had both arms wrapped tightly around a medium-sized dog with a caramel coat and dark eyes, who was entirely too quiet. What caught John's attention wasn't the scene itself. It was the absolute silence between the two of them. Not a groan, not a bark. As if they had made a pact not to draw any attention. John dismounted and made his way down the bank, grabbing onto branches to keep from slipping. When he got close, the old woman looked up and spoke, her voice far too steady for someone who had just taken a bad fall, telling him that he took long enough. He hadn't said his name. He hadn't said a word. And she smiled, like someone who was waiting for his reaction. Martha was 72 and had a mind like a steel trap. A resident of Creekwood, the small town about 4 miles from John's ranch, she had stepped back from public life after a hushed-up disagreement with Richard, the owner of the biggest lumber mill in the county, a man who wore a suit even in the dead of summer, famous for a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The dog, Buddy, had been hers for 4 years. He didn't bark at strangers, he just watched, sized them up, and made up his mind. John helped her up the embankment. She walked with a heavy limp, her ankle swelling fast. He tied his horse in the shade and helped her into the pickup truck he had left near the gate. On the drive back, she didn't say much, but it was enough to make John shift uncomfortably in his seat. She knew the name of his ranch. She knew his wife had passed away suddenly. She knew things that weren't exactly local gossip. The ankle, according to the clinic doctor, was badly sprained but not broken. Nothing life-threatening physically. But Martha asked not to go back to her house. She simply stated she wasn't safe there. John, who hadn't invited a single soul over for dinner in 2 years, set her up in the spare back bedroom. For the first few days, the tension inside the ranch house was as quiet as Buddy himself. John noticed the little things. Martha woke up before the sun, walked slowly to the window facing the county road, and just kept watch. Buddy always sat right by her side, his ears perked up. John asked what she was looking out for. She replied she was waiting to see what she didn't want to see. On Thursday of that first week, Tyler, a young farmhand who had been working at the ranch for about 3 months, came back from the Creekwood General Store with some unprompted news. Richard had been asking around about an elderly woman who went missing near the river. The story going around was that she was losing her mind and had wandered off from home. The whole town bought it. After all, Richard was a pillar of the community. He sponsored the Founders Day Festival and funded the high school football team. John listened to this with his jaw clenched tight. Something didn't add up. It was Helen, the neighbor who took in sewing and sometimes left fresh-baked bread by his gate, who brought the second piece of the puzzle. Just making passing conversation, she mentioned that for months Martha had been keeping ledger books, tracking the movement of logging trucks on the dirt road cutting through Richard's property. Trucks rolling out dead in the night. When confronted about it, Martha didn't deny a thing. She showed John exactly where she had been hit when she fell, not from stumbling but from being shoved. Richard had caught her by the riverbank just as she was writing down the license plate of one of those midnight trucks on her notepad. He had come up from behind, snatched the notepad, and she had slipped down the muddy bank trying to hold on to whatever she could. Richard had taken off before she even hit the ground, but he had looked down, seen she was still breathing, and chose to leave her there. Buddy had stayed by her side for 3 solid hours until John showed up. The real trouble started brewing in the second week when Richard figured out Martha had survived and that she was hiding somewhere out in the county. On Monday, John ran into town to pick up some cattle feed and bumped into Frank, a local shopkeeper and Richard's brother-in-law, leaning against the counter waiting for him. The small talk was way too polite. Frank asked with a weak smile if John had seen anyone around his property lately. John said he hadn't. Frank said that was good, in a tone that sounded an awful lot like a threat. By Wednesday, Gary, the county extension agent who drove around the ranches handing out municipal flyers, pulled up with a handbill featuring Martha's face and a description warning of a missing elderly woman suffering from mental confusion. The contact number at the bottom belonged to the lumber mill. John felt the walls closing in. He was harboring someone the entire town had been brainwashed into believing was a liability, rather than a victim. When Martha saw the flyer, she didn't even flinch. She just said that was exactly what she expected because he moves fast when he has something to hide. John started to realize he hadn't just tripped over a simple misunderstanding. He had stumbled into a buried secret Richard had been carrying for years. John's internal struggle boiled over on a rainy afternoon when Luke, his 22-year-old nephew who sometimes pitched in around the ranch, stormed in fuming. He said the folks in town were whispering that John had gone crazy from loneliness and was keeping a madwoman locked up in his house. The shame burned John's cheeks before he even heard the full sentence. He had spent 2 years quietly rebuilding his pride in silence after his wife passed. He had dodged anything that might spark rumors, gossip, or pity, and now his name was in everyone's mouth, for all the wrong reasons. He marched down the hall to Martha's room, fully intending to tell her she had to leave. But when he pushed the door open, he found Buddy lying right next to the bed, resting his head on Martha's lap while she slept sitting up, tightly clutching the scribbled notepad she had managed to fish out of her coat pocket against her chest. John froze in the doorway. That sight, a lonely, battered old woman, hugging a piece of paper like it was her proof of life, hit entirely too close to home. His own mother had gone through something eerily similar years back. A powerful man from the previous county where they lived had forced their family off their land using forged documents. Nobody had believed her. Nobody had stood by her side. John quietly closed the door without saying a word. But he also didn't ask her to leave. On Wednesday of the second week, Richard went further than the flyers. Through Alex, a local town councilman and longtime crony, he started circulating a much more aggressive version of the story, claiming John had kidnapped a vulnerable old lady, taking advantage of her fragile mental state for some shady payoff. The story was completely absurd, but in a small town, the absurd doesn't need evidence, it just needs repetition. Sarah, the town pharmacist and Tyler's wife, drove up to the ranch with a scowl, announcing her mother had forbidden Tyler from working out there anymore. Tyler stayed, but the heavy shadow of doubt stayed with him. Eleanor, an old friend of Martha's, was the only one who showed some courage. She knocked on the front gate on a foggy morning, clutching an envelope full of old letters Martha had left in her keeping. Letters laying out, over the course of months, exactly what she had uncovered about Richard. It wasn't just the movement of logging trucks, it was a massive land-grabbing scheme targeting the riverfront families who had been complaining for years without being heard. The lumber mill was acting as a front for illegally registering properties along the banks of Boulder River. Martha had stumbled onto it by pure chance while digging through old property records belonging to her late husband. She had started taking notes. She had gone way too deep for Richard to just let it slide. The worst moment hit on Friday of the third week. John had arranged with Claire, a county social worker he knew from his church-going days, to take Martha down to the county clerk's office to get certified copies made of the notes and letters. It was a simple, almost bureaucratic step. But that morning, Buddy started acting different. He let out a bark, which he never did, and kept nervously circling the pickup truck before they even loaded up. Tyler, who was still working the ranch, pointed out that the rear left tire was way too flat to be a coincidence. John changed the tire himself, his hands shaking less from being in a hurry and more from suppressed anger. The trip was delayed by 2 hours. During that delay, Richard appeared on the dirt road with his car pulled over to the side, acting as if he was having engine trouble. It was a staged act. As John drove past, Richard looked away, but Martha saw him and Richard saw her. They both knew the clock had run out. Down at the courthouse, while Claire was organizing the paperwork, Buddy was left outside tied to a railing. Halfway through the process, the dog started barking frantically. John rushed outside to check and found a man he didn't know trying to unclip the dog's leash. The man bolted. Buddy had cut himself yanking against the collar. A shallow scrape on his neck, nothing serious, but enough blood for John to understand that someone had tried to eliminate the only witness that couldn't be silenced with a smear campaign. It was Melissa, a reporter for a small regional news portal focusing on land issues, who finally reached out to John through Eleanor. She had been getting anonymous tips about the riverfront families for months, but never had the documentary proof. With the letters, Martha's ledger, and the exact dates and license plates, the material became publishable. Richard found out before it went to print. He tried one last desperate maneuver through Alex, offering to clear up an old property debt John had been fighting, a document that had been left hanging for years after his wife's passing, in exchange for his silence. John stared at that piece of paper for a long time. It was everything he had been trying to fix bureaucratically for 2 straight years. A shortcut life had placed right in his hand. He handed the document back, without a single explanation. On Saturday morning, with the sun still low and the river roaring louder than usual from the overnight rain, John saddled up his buckskin horse and led the group down to the exact spot where he had found Martha. The same muddy bank, the same slick edge. Riding with him were Claire, Melissa, and 2 state land investigators who had been called in after reviewing the documents. Richard was cornered at the lumber mill. There was nowhere left to run because the trap didn't spring from the top. It came from the bottom, from the records, the dates, the forged signatures that Martha had cataloged with the patience of someone who knows the truth doesn't need to be rushed. It just needs someone who won't give up. Martha went through her physical therapy for her ankle in town. She was walking without support by the 2nd week of recovery. Buddy slept at the foot of her bed every single night. Richard was hit with federal indictments for land fraud. His allies distanced themselves one by one, like pieces abandoning a king who lost the board. He stayed in his mansion, surrounded by lawsuits and the very same silence he had spent years building by treating people like obstacles. John headed back to the ranch. He finally fixed the front gate that had been sagging since winter. He sat down for a hot supper with Tyler and Luke on a bright moonlit night, for the first time in ages without the feeling that something was jammed in his chest. Buddy slept out in the barn, ears relaxed, belly full. And the river kept on roaring just like it always had, waiting for someone to finally listen to what the water had to say. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and tell me what city you are watching me from. I really want to know if you liked my story and I want to get to know you better. So subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help.